Hi guys, I thought it could be fun here near the end of the year to talk about the books that I have bought so far in 2021, the kind of progress I have and haven't made in reading those books that I bought, and then my plans for December. First, I'm going to revisit some stats from 2020, then I'm going to move on to 2021 to share with you the books that I have read, and then those that I haven't. And then at the end, I'm going to break down some of my buying statistics, and I'm going to save talking about books I want to buy soon for a video that I hope to make in the coming weeks. This might be a slightly longer video. Things can get rambly without an outline around here, but I have been enjoying it and kind of luxuriating in long videos this year, whether they're about books or anything else. And I don't know if that's the same for you guys, but I hope you enjoy this one. So unfinished business from last year. I made a series of videos where I at least named every single book that I bought in 2020. And of those 31 total books, there are 4 that I haven't read yet. 27 out of 31, honestly, a year on is pretty good. I'm pretty happy about that. The first of those is Summer by Ali Smith, and I think it's one of those cases where I just haven't felt like rereading the first 3 books in this quartet, and I know that this one echoes a lot of the themes in those and that I would appreciate it more if I were to reread them, but I think I'm just going to accept that I'm not going to get the full experience the first time, and I'm going to read this one on its own, and then at some point in the future go back and reread all 4 together. The next one is Afropean Notes from Black Europe by Johny, and it's called A Radical and Wide-Ranging Tour of Europe's Black Communities. I have read the introduction to this several times and been enthralled every time and then not gone on to read the book yet, so riddle me that. Another nonfiction book, All We Can Save, Truth, Courage, and Solutions for the Climate Crisis, which is edited by Ayana, Elisabeth Johnson, and Katharine K. Wilkinson. I've read another book this year on the climate crisis that had a more dire cast to it than this one might. And because there's so many contributors to this, I really am looking forward to hearing this many voices and this many takes on different aspects of the climate crisis. Lastly, Notes from a Dead House by Fyodor Dostoevsky, translated from Russian by Richard Pevear and Larissa Volokhonsky. I mean, who doesn't want to read a 19th century mostly autobiographical novel about hard labor in a Siberian prison camp? I still feel a real spark when I look at each one of these 4, and so I might do a project, starting like January 1st, where I read these 4 and then I can say that I've read all the books I bought in 2020. I think that'd be really cool. Oh, hang on. We have a visitor. Say hello. He's doing great. He and Lila are together, and they're good friends now. Well, they're friends. I don't know if Lila would say they're good friends, but they get along just fine, which is all that I have wanted out of this relationship. Compared to 31 books that I bought in 2020, this year, and I'm filming this at the very end of November, I have bought 21 books. I've read 11 of those, and it's going to be 12 today. I'm almost finished another, but still, it's not great. And I'd like to make some headway with the 9 unread books in the last month of the year. First, though, let's talk about the 12 that haven't been neglected. So the first was Wintering: The Power of Rest and Retreat in Difficult Times by Katharine May, which is a memoir about a time in May's life when she, her husband, and her son all had a combination of illness and personal issues and things that took them out of the flow of their normal everyday lives. She relates this a lot to how in the natural world it's very common for animals and insects to retreat in this manner, and how we don't really allow that in ourselves as human animals. I bought this, I think, at the beginning of February at one of my local bookstores, and I said to the cashier, is this like a popular one at the moment? And he was like, yeah, that one's leaping off the shelves. The book I'm almost finished is The Future is History: How Totalitarianism Reclaimed Russia by Masha, Gessen. This is about 490 pages, and I have 30 pages left. So this is one of those that I think I'll be discussing in several future videos. I'm not going to dwell on it too much here, but I think it's been so useful for me to put together kind of all in one reading experience what I've previously been experiencing in an article here, a news story there, my personal experiences in Russia. I think having all of it consolidated in this really masterful way by Gessen has been incredibly useful. I will say that I've been reading a lot of this before bed, and that wasn't a problem until last night. There is a chapter near the end here that made me feel physically ill, and I really struggled to fall asleep. Giacomo, can you please behave? Please. The subject matter is unerringly grim, but Gessen gets their points across without editorializing mostly. And I think it's a really impressive experience and nuanced. And yeah, I have a lot of positive things to say about this book. And we come to the only book I bought this year that I no longer own, which speaks for itself, really. It is The Poppy War by R.F. Kuang. This is the first book in a fantasy trilogy. It's set in a world that seems to be based on several different eras of Chinese history, and particularly Chinese and Japanese military conflict. This is billed as adult fantasy, and in feel and tone and pacing, it feels much more like YA fantasy to me. And it is incredibly rushed, jumbled, internally contradictory, even from like one paragraph to the next. There's a lot of attempt at character development without a lot of success. There's shock value that's just shocking and not valuable. I don't think this is a very good book. I will not be continuing on with the series. But two takeaways from this. One is that Kuang wrote this book when she was like 20 years old or something. And I think, we can use case studies of people like Zadie Smith, who like, oh, Zadie Smith wrote White Teeth when she was 6 years old. But like for even the rest of the very intelligent portion of humanity, like, you're going to develop your writing skills and just your awareness of what you want to write and how you want to write it so much throughout the course of your 20s that somebody who wrote a book when they were 20 or 21, I don't see this as much of a reflection on R.F. Kuang's potential, and I am interested in books from her apart from this trilogy. And the second thing is that it was just such like a splash of cold water in terms of like showing me how much I've been depriving myself by only really looking for fantasy books that are set in medieval Britain, essentially, or medieval continental Europe, if like I'm getting spicy. I just think that the setting was so interesting to me, and it made me really hunger for fantasy books set in Asian worlds. Next up is Obit by Victoria Chang. This is a poetry collection. These are largely prose poems, although not entirely, and they're focused on her parents' decline in health and ultimately their deaths. And the way that she does this is she writes obituaries for different aspects of her parents' lives, but also for her own life. So she gets into sort of philosophical and personal obituaries. Like, for example, Memory died on July 11th, 2015. And then she goes on to write the obituary for that part of her memory. Optimism died on August 3rd, 2015. Logic, my father's Logic, died on June 24th, 2009 in bright daylight. I loved this conceptually more than I loved the actual reading experience, but I've been thinking a lot about elderly grandparents and parents having health problems, to be totally frank with you. I've thought a lot more about that in the past 2 years, and I think for that reason, this collection will stay on my shelf and will be something that I will probably be returning to. Believing the Lie by Elisabeth George. There was a period earlier this year where all I wanted was family-driven murders in the English countryside, all focused on a police procedural. Like, that was what I wanted, and Elisabeth George was my go-to person for that. I've read, of the Inspector Lindley series, of which there are currently 20 books, I've read numbers 20 and then 19, and then this is number 17 because I walked into a bookstore one day and they didn't have number 18. And I think this is a really good example of how she pulls so many different threads together, not just all the little facts and pieces of any type of murder mystery, but also the emotional threads and thematic threads. They all really develop throughout the book in a satisfying way. Do you guys want to see Lila too? I haven't shown her on camera recently just because she doesn't jump up to where I'm filming as much as he does. 1 second.
Oh, look how big she is. Look how big. Say hello.
You can't always tell just from, how a cat or a person looks, but you actually can tell from her face that she's just much, much dumber than he is. For Minor Detail by Adania Shibli, translated from Arabic by Elisabeth Jaquette, I have a video I can link below where Matthew, Kendra, and I have essentially a book club all about this. Such an intriguing book of 2 parts, largely about how difficult it is for Palestinians to study records of their own history. And Kendra was the one who originally brought this up, and then Matthew sort of piggybacked off it. And I keep thinking about that exchange that they have about how we as Americans and a lot of other people around the world take it for granted that we can study the minutia of certain elements of our history from a certain time period, but how the woman in the second half of this book is struggling to find any kind of details about this history. The next two books feel like such a pairing to me. So the first is Dressed for a Dance in the Snow, Women's Voices from the Gulag by Monika Zgustová, and this is translated from Spanish by Julie Jones. And the other one is The Unwomanly Face of War by Svetlana Alexievich, an oral history of women in World War II, and this is translated from Russian by Richard Pevear and Larissa Volokhonsky. So I went into a bookstore at the beginning of Women in Translation Month, and whenever I'm in a bookstore, I always go to the world history section and then look to see just what they have from Central and Eastern Europe out of curiosity. I'd been seeing this one in a number of different stores. I liked the cover, I liked the spine. Who doesn't want to read about the Gulag? So I picked it up. And it's 9 women's stories, and Zgustová goes to interview them. And it's interesting because this is much more straightforward narratively than Alexievich's work, which is this melodically chaotic chorus of voices of so many different women that she interviews, and then she takes her own questions out and splices it all together, whereas this is a lot more streamlined, although there are stories within stories, and there are all these asides about very, very famous Russian figures in this book too. So I found both methodology choices really inspiring in different ways. I would say that maybe I'm just conventional. I did prefer the Zgustová, but what I especially loved about The Unwomanly Face of War is that this was Alexievich's first of her brand of documentary literature that she's now famous for. Currently, I think she has 6 books that she's written in Russian with this style, but only 5 have been translated into English. And this is the very first. And so in the beginning, she's explicitly grappling with the kind of interviews that she's experiencing and what she wants to make of them, and how she's trying to use the format of the book to convey the themes of everything that she's uncovering from these hidden voices. It's just so interesting to see her trying to articulate what she then goes on to perfect in her later books. Also for Women in Translation Month, I read Abigail by, I have been pronouncing this Magda Sabo, but a Hungarian speaker recently told me it's actually closer to Magda Sabo. Hungarians, please feel free to confirm or deny in the comments. But I read The Door last year, loved it to pieces. And this is so different, but I also loved it. It says on the back that this is her most beloved book within Hungary. Oh, this is translated from Hungarian by Len Rick. This is about a young girl who, on the eve of World War II really truly reaching Hungary, is sent to a remote and strict school. I'm not going to talk about it much here because I'm going to feature it in a video coming up about unconventional World War II novels from Eastern Europe, and this really is such an interesting spin on what you would expect from these kinds of stories. On to the last few that I've read. This one is Seeing People Off by Jana Beňová. This is translated from Slovak by Janet Livingston. And I mentioned this in my recent video about my life being chaos, kind of like this cover. I wouldn't have thought that I would love this book because it's incredibly experimental, and it's about this group of bohemian friends being bohemian in this kind of washed up neighborhood of Bratislava. But I did love it, and I just found it really both joyous and sad, and neither overwhelmed the other, and very playful, tongue-in-cheek, self-aware without being annoyingly so. I loved the crass elements of it, but didn't think that they overtook the rest of the writing either. There are a lot of really poignant moments. It's just such a mishmash of experiences and scenes, and I had a lot of fun with it. The last 2 are nonfiction books. So this one is The Uninhabitable Earth, Life After Warming by David Wallace Wells. I feel really conflicted, not about my experience with the book. This was so impactful for me. Actually, within the first 5 pages, I stopped reading the book and went and switched to clean energy. You know, I've read about the climate crisis for years, but it's been through newspaper and magazine articles, one here, one there. I follow a newsletter called Heated that talks about the climate crisis, but having a lot of the knowledge that I was already aware of and some pretty stark knowledge that I was not aware of all consolidated into something that this is only about, 250 pages. And it is packed. It is packed with information. I felt like it was a real wake-up call for me in a way that I'm sure Wallace Wells intended it to be, even for people who feel like they sort of are already on this train and think that this is a very important topic. I now have come away thinking that this is like the most important thing that any of us could be discussing. And for that reason, I would love to make a video sharing some of the most interesting details from this book. What holds me back from being sure that I'll do that is, I mean, it's been a difficult year, and I'm not gonna lie to you, I'm running low on maybe the most important resource you can have as a human being in the world, which is patience. And I think that I would get certain types of comments that would make me want to bash my brains out. I'm just not feeling up to dealing with destructive delusion about the climate crisis. So, I mean, it's sad for me to think that and say that, because I think the majority of people, you know, would be interested in hearing about this book and in what I might have to say about it. But I don't know, you guys, I'm going to need to weigh the pros and cons of this one. And on to something brighter, The Massacre of a Loving Family. The Romanov Sisters, The Lost Lives of the Daughters of Nicholas and Alexandra by Helen Rappaport was the most recent book that I bought this year, and I talked about it at length, at least about the first half of it, in a video that I can link below. And I'm such a huge, I was going to say a fan. I don't know if you could say like you're a fan of the final Romanov family, but I've always been so drawn to their stories, but mostly through internet rabbit holes. And this is the first time I'd read a whole book on this. So I encourage you, if you are interested in the Romanovs, to go to that video just to look through the comments section, because both specialists and hobbyists truly came out for me. And I feel like that comment section now is such a great resource for anybody looking for further books about the Romanovs. Okay, now for the shameful 9 that I haven't read. For the ones that I have read, I mostly went in order of when I bought them, but for these, I'm separating them into kind of thematic categories. And the first is the only remaining fantasy book, which is Piranesi by Susanna Clarke. I was pushed over the edge because this won the Women's Prize, and I'm so intrigued that a fantasy novel won a major prize like that. It makes my heart sing that it did. I haven't read Jonathan Strange and Mr. Norrell, but it also intrigues me that that book is such a brick of a thing, whereas this one is under 250 pages, and how you're going to create an entire fantasy world and be able to develop much of anything within that page span. I want to see how she does it. I've also heard Borges comparisons, which is just like, say no more as far as I'm concerned. So I would like to do a full review on this book. I don't think I'll get to it before the end of the year because I have a major deadline of something due in January that's taking up a lot of my time at the moment. But if I can, I would love to get that review out in January. The next 3 are also all books that I plan to read in December, as sort of treat yourself December. That's kind of what these 3 books are to me, because each one of them just seems like pure fun. Well, I mean, some of them are kind of grim too, but you know, the kind of fun that I have at least. So one of them is Cold Comfort Farm by Stella Gibbons. This is the Penguin Deluxe Classic Edition. And I'll leave a video linked below to Steve Donahue talking about this book, because I must have watched that video 3 times during lockdown last year. It just brought me so much joy, and you can tell how much he loves this book. Yeah, I don't know how you'd come away from that video not wanting to read it. So I bought it. Apparently it's a parody of sentimental rural novels of the time, which you can tell from the fact that, like, for example, the 4 cows in the book are called feckless, aimless, graceless, and pointless. The famous first part of the first sentence. The education bestowed on Flora Post by her parents had been expensive, athletic, and prolonged. While I was reading Believing the Lie, number 17 in the Inspector Lindley series, I also bought Just One Evil Act online because I could not find this one in any bookstores. And by the time it arrived, I was no longer in my murder mystery crime novel mood, but I could be easily pushed back into it in December. When I lied, I said Piranesi was the only fantasy novel in this. This is clearly another fantasy novel. It is Assassin's Fate by Robin Hobb, the last of the Realm of the Elderlings series, book 16 of 16, and I read the first book in November of 2016. So it's taken me 5 years to read this series, and I think this would be a good time to bring it home and tie up all those loose ends. I just don't want it to be over. I have enjoyed spacing it out that much, 16 books over 5 years, because it's the only opportunity I have to read each of them for the first time. I always feel jealous of people who, for example, they're like, oh, I've never read Pride and Prejudice. I'm embarrassed. I'm like, don't be, because you get to experience it for the first time. That's how I feel about the Realm of the Elderlings series. And the remaining 5 are all books from and about Central and Eastern Europe. So this one is In Memory of Memory by Maria Stepanova, translated from Russian by Sasha Dugdale. And this is Stepanova going through her late aunt's apartment and all of the memorabilia and letters and diaries that she finds there. The only reason that I haven't read it is just that I have been suffering from some amount of brain fog, and I have felt that this will be challenging in a good way, in a way that I'll really enjoy. But I guess involved is a better word than challenging for how I expect this experience to be, and very intricate. But if I don't read this by the end of the year, I would like to at least in January, because this, along with Piranesi, these are the 2 books that I am sure I would like to do full reviews on. Then I mentioned this for Women in Translation Month, but didn't actually get to it at the time. It is Trieste by Dasha Durndich. That's difficult for my poor English-speaking tongue to say. This is translated from Croatian by Ellen. Is it Elias Bersac or Elias Bersac? Apparently this is a rather unconventional World War II novel. I thought it sounded pretty conventional based on the few sentences I'd read about it online, but then a few of you in my comment section mentioned that it is different from what you've read on the topic before. So it's about an old woman's obsessive search for her son, who was fathered by an SS officer and was stolen away 62 years before by the Nazi authorities as part of the Lebensborn project. I felt really inspired by Dressed for a Dance in the Snow and The Unwomanly Face of War to read more Russian poetry. And I have read poems from Anna Akhmatova before, but this is the first physical, I can annotate as much as I want edition of her selected poems that I've owned. I also already own a biography of Anna Akhmatova, and I'd like to read this alongside that. And I forgot to say, this is translated from Russian by D.M. Thomas. Ending with 2 nonfiction books. The first is Red Famine, Stalin's War on Ukraine by Anne Applebaum. When I read Bloodlands by Timothy Snyder last year, the first section on that was about the man-made Ukrainian famine of 1933. And I said in a video on that book that I wanted to read an entire book just about the Ukrainian famine, and you guys came through for me, recommended this one. Who doesn't want to read a whole Anne Applebaum book about starvation and cannibalism? And then speaking of Timothy here, we have Black Earth, the Holocaust as History and Warning. And I think it's one of those things where I read the first 2 chapters of this when it arrived, but I wasn't in the headspace to continue at the moment. I don't even mean emotionally. I just mean I was reading several other books at the time. And even within those first 2 chapters, I saw what people have been saying about this book to me for several years now, that it retreads a lot of common ground about the Holocaust, but within a framework that makes it feel newly paved in some sections. And I love the tension there of ground that feels trodden and untrodden at the same time. So if by the end of today I'll have read 12 of these 21 books, I would say that by the end of December, I want to have read at least 16 of 21, preferably 17 or 18, but I would be happy with 16. I've jotted down a few stats here. So of these 21 books, 8 of them are nonfiction, possibly 9, depending on how you count In Memory of Memory. And of those 8 to 9 books, only 1 is a traditional memoir. There are 3 fantasy books in here, 2 crime/police procedurals, 2 poetry collections. Of the 21 books, 11 are from or about Central and Eastern Europe, and only 5 authors of all of these are ones I've previously read. Everybody else is a brand new author. And then this last stat took me back a bit. Of these, I would say that only 1 can really be considered a classic, the poetry from Akhmatova, and then both Cold Comfort Farm and Abigail might be considered modern classics. But everything else is a contemporary book. And I think that's been the real hole in my reading year. And for 2022, I'd like to get back on my Dostoevsky, Edith Wharton, George Eliot train. That was really fun, and now I'm surrounded by stacks of books. Do let me know what's going on with you guys for your end of the year reading, or share any thoughts about these titles that I mentioned, and I'll see you soon for another video.